Welcome to the moment a German soldier realized his enemy was saving his life, not ending it. April 1945. Berlin burned like a dying star, collapsing into itself. And somewhere among the rubble, amid the screaming walls and shattered cathedrals, a Soviet soldier reached out not to kill, but to bandage. The air was thick with dust and smoke, the kind that tasted like rust and memory. Boots crushed glass. Orders were drowned by the roar of collapsing streets. 1,000 guns fired at once, and yet in one corner of hell, silence bloomed. A Russian hand lifted a German face, and life for one impossible second refused to die. Before we begin, leave a comment where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening. Tell me, would you have done the same? Would you have saved the man who invaded your home, burned your village, killed your brothers? April 28, 1945. The battle for Berlin was nearly over. The Reichstag loomed like a dying monument, its pillars cracked, its flags torn into ghosts. Every window was a sniper's mouth, every street a maze of fire. The Red Army advanced block by block, house by house, turning the city into a slow-motion apocalypse. German soldiers, most barely 20, fought in panic, their commands breaking down, their radio signals fading into static. Civilians hid beneath stairwells, clutching breadcrumbs and broken rosaries. The smell of smoke, oil, and fear mingled into a single breathless fog. And through that fog, a Soviet sergeant named Mikhail Morozov stepped over a corpse, his boots sinking into ash. He had lost his unit. The sound of artillery was distant now, replaced by the eerie rhythm of dripping water through a cracked pipe. That was when he saw him lying half-conscious beside a burned-out truck, wearing the faded gray of the Wehrmacht. The man's face was caked with blood, his eyes barely open. And then, almost imperceptibly, the German whispered something, 3 words in broken Russian. "Don't shoot. Please." For a heartbeat, Mikhail froze. His rifle hung mid-air. His instincts screamed, "Finish it." This was war. This was justice. But something deeper moved beneath the rage, the faint sound of breath. Human. Fragile. The German's head tilted, and Mikhail saw the wound, a deep gash near the temple, bleeding into the dust. Without thinking, he dropped his rifle, tore a strip from his own undershirt, and began wrapping it around the man's skull. His hands trembled not from fear, but disbelief. In that moment, time fractured. Around them, tanks rumbled, soldiers shouted, grenades cracked. But here, only 2 men existed. Enemy and enemy, predator and prey. But the battlefield didn't care who was supposed to live. The German, later identified as Corporal Dieter Lenz, could barely process it. Through the haze, he saw his captor's face, dark-scarred, covered in soot. A man who should have spat, should have walked away. Yet those same hands lifted him, pressed the bandage tight, whispered words in a language he could barely recognize. "Stay still. You're safe now." What he didn't know was that Mikhail had lost his younger brother 2 months earlier near Königsberg, shot by a sniper wearing the same uniform Lenz now bled in. What he didn't know was that Mikhail had sworn he'd never forgive, never show mercy. Yet here he was, kneeling over an enemy's body, feeling the pulse under his palms. Outside, Soviet tanks crushed the last barricades. Artillery smoke turned the midday sky into a storm. The Reich's final breath was being drawn. Commanders shouted coordinates, soldiers marked walls with chalk, medics dragged stretchers through mud and glass. Yet amid that machinery of death, this quiet rebellion took place. A man refusing to hate for just 1 minute longer. No one photographed the moment when the bandage was tied. No one recorded the silence that followed. Only one image survives, a frame caught by a Soviet war correspondent minutes later, showing Mikhail's hands pressed gently against Lenz's face, eyes locked, not in triumph, but in something far more dangerous than pity, recognition. The realization that they were both prisoners now of the same war, the same madness, the same impossible question. Berlin was falling fast. Hitler was hiding in his bunker beneath the chancellery, dictating orders to ghosts. SS units still fought in scattered pockets, burning everything behind them. The Soviets had already raised their flag over the Reichstag, but pockets of resistance refused to die. Every soldier who survived those days carried the same haunting thought: how much humanity could survive inside so much ruin. Lenz would later recall the moment as the first time I realized the enemy had a heart. In his diary found decades later in a village archive, he wrote, "I wanted to hate him. I wanted to spit at him. But when he looked at me, I saw the same exhaustion I felt, the same disbelief that we were still alive. What makes this moment extraordinary is not the act itself, but its impossibility." The Soviet army had lost more than 25 million lives by that point. Entire cities erased, families, starved villages turned to ash. The propaganda called Germans beasts, devils, invaders. The rage was not abstract, it was generational. Yet somehow, in the ruins of Berlin, one soldier refused to obey that rage. Imagine the silence between them, the weight of history pressing down like dust from the collapsing walls. Imagine the faces watching soldiers who had lost everything, staring as their comrades spared the man they were taught to despise. Some called him a fool, others turned away, but a few stood still, unsure what to feel. The photograph of that encounter, later published anonymously, traveled quietly through Soviet archives buried under decades of red tape. It wasn't used for propaganda. It didn't fit the narrative. The state wanted heroes, not empathy. It wanted victory, not forgiveness. So the picture disappeared until years later, when a historian found it misfiled under medical aid, Berlin sector. But tonight you're seeing it again, and perhaps for the first time hearing the story behind it. This is not a tale of war, it's a story of the moment war hesitated. When a soldier trained to kill chose instead to heal. When the line between enemy and brother blurred into something unbearably human. April 1945. The last breath of the Third Reich echoed through the crumbling streets of Berlin. The city that once roared with parades and steel now whispered with ghosts. Smoke rose from every direction, black, dense, endless, curling into a sky that no longer knew the difference between night and day. The ground shook beneath the weight of Soviet artillery shells, falling every 30 seconds, tearing open the skeleton of the city. Bridges collapsed into rivers of debris. The air was filled with ash and snow, impossible to tell which was which. Inside basements, civilians whispered prayers, their voices trembling with dust. Above them, the Red Army advanced division after division, closing the noose around the Nazi capital. Berlin was no longer a city. It was a wound that refused to stop bleeding. The First Belarusian Front under Marshal Zhukov was attacking from the east, storming through the Oder defenses, with over 2.5 million men, 6,000 tanks, and 40,000 artillery pieces. From the south came Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front, crushing what remained of the Wehrmacht's reserves. To the north, Rokossovsky sealed the Baltic escape routes. The German High Command had no more illusions, only fanatic orders. Hitler's last radio transmissions demanded every man, woman, and child fight to the death. The Volkssturm, old men, schoolboys, and crippled veterans were handed rifles older than they were. Every corner was a bunker. Every apartment window became a firing slit. The city had become a labyrinth of desperation. The Soviets called it Operation Berlin. Their maps were marked with crimson lines cutting across the city like veins. Their orders were simple: advance at any cost. For every street gained, hundreds of bodies fell. Entire platoons disappeared in the smoke. Yet morale stayed high. This was revenge for Stalingrad, for Leningrad, for every village burned, and every child buried in the snow. Each soldier carried photographs of the dead. Some carved names into their rifles. For them, this was not just war, it was justice wrapped in flame. But beneath that fury, something more complex brewed. Soviet soldiers entered a world unlike the one they'd fought in for years. Berlin was the heart of the enemy's empire, its streets lined with statues, theaters, churches, zoos, all now hollowed by fire. They walked through the ruins of ideology, through propaganda posters half-burned but still whispering about a 1,000-year Reich. They found portraits of Hitler on cracked walls next to photographs of families who had fled or perished. They saw what the war had done not just to others, but to themselves. And in that realization, something shifted. The rage was still there, but so was exhaustion, and an unspoken longing for it all to end. The average Soviet infantryman had marched over 2,000 kilometers to reach Berlin. Many had fought non-stop since 1941. Their uniforms were torn, their boots soaked in mud and blood. Rations were low nerves frayed. The sound of constant shelling became the heartbeat of the city. Every night the horizon flickered red like a dying furnace. Civilians stumbled through the ruins like ghosts dragging carts of belongings that no longer mattered. Children searched for water in craters filled with rain and ash. Dogs barked, then vanished into the fog. Berlin was collapsing, not just under fire, but under the unbearable weight of its own delusion. Inside Hitler's bunker, 20 meters beneath the Reich Chancellery, madness reigned. Maps no longer mattered. Divisions that didn't exist were still being moved across imaginary fronts. Reports of Soviet advances were met with silence or rage. Hitler's generals whispered about surrender, but no one dared speak the word aloud. In the streets above, the SS still executed anyone who tried to flee. The Gestapo shot deserters in alleys while Soviet artillery thundered closer. By April 25th, the city was completely encircled. No reinforcements, no air support. Only the echo of hopeless commands bouncing off concrete walls. For the Red Army, every block was a battle. The city center was divided into sectors, each assigned to different regiments. Snipers hid in the shadows of half-collapsed churches. Machine guns fired from shattered balconies. Soviet tanks advanced cautiously, their gunners aiming at windows that could explode with a single flash of Panzerfaust. It was urban warfare at its most brutal, face-to-face, breath-to-breath. One corner could cost 50 men, one stairwell could turn into a grave. The air itself felt alive, hot, dense, vibrating with screams and explosions. And yet, amid that chaos, there was an eerie rhythm. Orders shouted in Russian and German intertwined like a broken symphony. Smoke rose in spirals that looked almost peaceful against the burning skyline. Somewhere a piano played its sound, warped by the echo of artillery. It was said that even the crows had fled Berlin, leaving only silence between bombardments. For those still alive, time lost meaning. Hours melted into seconds. A single day felt like eternity, stretched thin by fear. The hospitals had collapsed. Medics operated in basements by candlelight, their hands shaking as they stitched wounds on floors covered in soot. Water was scarce. Food was gone. Morphine was gold. German doctors treated soldiers next to civilians, next to children, next to dying SS men whose uniforms still smelled of smoke. On the Soviet side, field hospitals were overwhelmed, stretching resources to the limit. Yet still they treated enemy wounded when they found them, if only because no one could tell who was who anymore. Dirt blood and exhaustion had turned everyone the same shade of gray. By April 29th, the Soviet forces had reached the heart of the city. The Reichstag stood defiant, riddled with bullet holes, but still upright. It was the symbol everyone wanted, the trophy that would mark the end. Soviet troops fought through its corridors, each floor echoing with gunfire and screams. German soldiers surrendered in small groups, their faces blank, their weapons clattering against the marble. Outside, prisoners were herded into makeshift camps, some defiant, some weeping, most silent. For many Soviets, seeing their enemies broken did not bring triumph. It brought emptiness. Somewhere amid this storm, Sergeant Mikhail Morozov carried his rifle through the ruins of a government district. He'd lost count of the bodies. The noise had become a constant vibration in his skull. He was no longer fighting for ideology or command or even revenge. He was fighting to stay sane, to keep one piece of himself human. And then he stumbled upon Dieter Lenz, barely breathing, lying in the rubble with his helmet shattered beside him. That moment, that impossible flicker of mercy, would outlive every tank and every bullet fired that week. But before that instant came, the world had to collapse around them first. What made Berlin unique was not just its destruction, but its symmetry of despair. The Germans fought for a leader who was already dead in spirit. The Soviets fought for victory that no longer felt like redemption. Both sides were shadows of their former selves. The human soul had been stretched to its breaking point, and in that fracture something honest appeared. In the archives of the Soviet Fifth Shock Army dispatches, describe the final assault as a battle fought not for territory, but for closure. Commanders wrote of soldiers pausing mid-fight to help civilians, of medics who treated both sides, of officers who refused to fire when surrender was clear. These small acts, buried beneath layers of violence, hinted at a strange truth: humanity survives even where it should not. As night fell on April 30th, the red flag was raised over the Reichstag. The world called it victory. But for those who lived through it, it felt more like the end of civilization itself. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound of all the shells combined. Men stared at the ground, unsure if they were conquerors or survivors. The city was dead, yet somehow still breathing. It was within this purgatory, this fragile pause between destruction and rebirth, that one photograph would emerge. A Soviet soldier, his uniform torn, his face smeared with soot, gently holding the head of a man in gray. No hate, no triumph, just exhaustion and something dangerously close to compassion. The streets outside still smoked, buildings still burned, but in that small circle of light, war, if only for a heartbeat, forgot itself. And the question that haunted both men in that moment still lingers even now. After so many years and so many wars, what does it mean to win? If saving your enemy feels more human than killing him ever could. The facts of that final week in Berlin are brutal, undeniable, mathematical, carved into the ledgers of war. Between April 16th and May 2nd, 1945, the Battle of Berlin consumed nearly 2 million soldiers, 50,000 pieces of heavy artillery, and more than 200 tanks. The Soviet army lost over 80,000 men in those 17 days, killed not wounded, while another 280,000 were injured or maimed. German casualties are harder to count. Many were never recorded. Civilian soldiers, children pressed into the Volkssturm bodies, vanished in collapsed buildings or burned in the streets. For every kilometer the Red Army advanced, thousands of lives were extinguished. No map can truly capture that arithmetic of despair. The numbers sound abstract until you realize every digit once had a heartbeat. The Soviet artillery barrage that began on April 16th was so intense that even seasoned officers compared it to the apocalypse. Over 1 million shells in 24 hours. The sky turned red from the constant blaze. The earth trembled for kilometers. Radio communications jammed under the electromagnetic storm of explosions. The sound could be heard in Poland, 200 miles away. German defenses collapsed within hours, but not without inflicting terrible wounds. Anti-tank teams, teenagers with Panzerfausts, crawled through sewers and cellars waiting for tanks to pass, before firing at point-blank range. For every Soviet T-34 that crossed a street, at least 3 burned. Streets became graveyards of iron and flesh. The Soviets used floodlights at night to blind defenders. The Germans adapted firing at the beams to mask their retreat. Every innovation was met with counter-innovation, every advantage purchased with more blood. Soviet engineers built pontoon bridges under sniper fire. Field medics hauled stretchers through burning intersections where mortars landed every 20 seconds. The advance was unstoppable, but it was not merciful. The war had lost its rhythm, its discipline. It had become pure inertia. Documents from the Soviet 8th Guards Army describe the fighting as house-to-house annihilation. Streets were divided into grids, each captured building marked with chalk and the initials of the unit that took it. Progress was measured not in meters but in walls breached. For every building seized, a dozen others stood waiting, each one a fortress. The Germans, running out of ammunition, used furniture and rubble as barricades. Some fought with pistols, others with knives. In one report, a Soviet officer wrote that the smell of cordite was so thick it coated his tongue like metal dust. Another recalled how the flames made it impossible to tell day from night. Berlin glowed 24 hours a day like a furnace that refused to cool. Fact after fact paints the same picture, a city disintegrating, its defenders trapped in a death spiral of pride and denial. The German command estimated that for every hour the city resisted, 10,000 more civilians died, whether by shelling, starvation, or execution. But orders were orders. Hitler refused to surrender. "The German people have proven themselves unworthy of me," he declared. "They shall perish." Those words became prophecy. Within the week he would be dead. And yet, even as the command collapsed, something remarkable occurred on the Soviet side, an unexpected adherence to medical protocol, almost bureaucratic, almost absurd in the chaos. Field units were instructed to render aid to all injured persons within operational control zones. In practice, that meant both sides if the situation allowed. Red Cross markings still appeared on some helmets, though mostly faded, or smeared with mud. The medical corps under Commander Smirnov documented at least 400 German POWs treated for wounds severe enough to require surgical attention. In several cases, those operations were conducted in the same rooms where firefights had taken place hours earlier. A photograph recovered from the Central Front archives shows Soviet and German wounded lying side by side on wooden floors, their uniforms indistinguishable under grime and soot. This was not mercy, it was procedure. But within that procedure, fragments of humanity emerged. Soldiers shared cigarettes with prisoners. Medics used the same canteens for both sides. Translators recorded snippets of conversation between captor and captive, simple phrases almost childlike in their sincerity. It's over. We're alive. No more shooting. These fragments survive in war diaries and after-action reports buried in military archives under neutral headings like interpersonal contact in combat zones. But the language betrays the emotion behind the ink. Some soldiers wrote about how strange it felt to see the enemy's face up close. One wrote, "We were told they were monsters. But monsters bleed like we do." Berlin's hospitals were beyond collapse. The Charité, once the pride of German medicine, had its windows blown out and its operating theaters buried under rubble. Soviet doctors set up triage centers in the ruins of schools, churches, even subway tunnels. Electricity was gone. Surgeries were done by lantern. Supplies were scavenged from enemy depots, morphine bandages, even German field kits repurposed to save Soviet lives. There was no longer such a thing as sides in the language of medicine. Only survival. By April 27th, the Soviets captured the Moabit district, a key defensive sector northwest of the Reichstag. It was there that several first-hand reports describe encounters between Soviet medics and German prisoners. Some accounts mention a black-and-white photograph, an image matching the one of Mikhail Morozov and Dieter Lenz. The original caption reads, "Soviet soldier giving medical aid to wounded German POW near Invalidenstrasse." The report accompanying it lists the location time 1432 and the Unit 5th Shock Army 301st Rifle Division. That means the event occurred just as the final push toward the Reichstag began. Historians later confirmed the authenticity of the image by matching building facades in the background to known ruins of the area. The act itself, one soldier saving another, was statistically rare but not unique. Yet the timing made it symbolic. Within 48 hours, Berlin would fall. Within 72 hours, Hitler would be dead. The photograph captured a heartbeat between those two facts, a fleeting moment when cruelty paused to breathe. Military correspondence from the front lines also notes the psychological toll. Commanders warned of emotional fatigue among troops and loss of aggression indicators. In other words, soldiers were too tired to hate. They had seen too much, buried too many comrades, endured too much loss. What propaganda could not achieve, human exhaustion had. Compassion, or something resembling it, began to surface in the cracks of exhaustion. Meanwhile, German radio broadcasts still insisted on victory. "Berlin holds firm," one announcer declared, even as Soviet shells fell behind him. Civilians who tuned in clung to the illusion. But on the ground, there was no more ideology, only instinct. For Soviet soldiers, that instinct sometimes meant choosing between killing and saving. Most chose killing. A few, like Morozov, did not. Decades later, Soviet field records, declassified in 1987, revealed several cases of unexpected mercy. In one report from the 3rd Shock Army, a lieutenant ordered his men to escort 2 wounded German prisoners to a field medic, despite orders to prioritize Soviet casualties. "We treat the living first," he said. The medic's diary from that day ends with one line, "No side, only blood." The historical truth is cold but clear. These acts of compassion did not change the course of the war. They did not shorten it, did not spare the city, did not rewrite history. But they revealed the limits of hatred, and that perhaps is more enduring than victory. When statisticians later reviewed casualty data, they found something striking. In the final week of April, recorded executions of POWs dropped by almost 40%. Whether due to chaos, confusion, or conscience, no one knows. But somewhere inside that chaos, a pattern of restraint emerged. When the war ended, the victors wrote their reports. The numbers filled the pages, tons of ammunition, kilometers gained, prisoners captured. But none of those reports mentioned what could not be measured: the look between two enemies when one decided not to let the other die. No document can record the pause before compassion, the trembling of hands that should have been steady on a trigger. And yet, that is where the war truly ended. Not with a surrender, not with a signature, but with a moment of silence between gunfire. Facts tell us the Soviet army won the Battle of Berlin in 17 days. They tell us Hitler died in his bunker. They tell us Germany surrendered unconditionally. But facts alone cannot explain how in that same city one Soviet soldier saw his reflection in the eyes of his enemy and chose mercy over vengeance. That is not in any report, but it happened. The photograph proves it. The blood-stained bandage proves it. The breath that refused to stop proves it. And when history tries to speak only through numbers, through maps and memoranda, this single act whispers louder. Because even in the most calculated war, where death is counted and organized, one man's decision to save another remains the only equation that makes sense. He had not expected to feel the warmth of another man's blood on his hands and mistake it for his own. The battle had reduced every sense to instinct: duck, fire, run, breathe. But when Mikhail Morozov saw the German soldier lying in the rubble, something in him hesitated. It wasn't strategy. It wasn't pity. It was recognition, an exhausted heartbeat that sounded like his own. The dust clung to his face like snow, the air stung with the metallic taste of cordite. His ears rang from the echo of tank shells bouncing off stone. He crouched, rifle hanging from his shoulder, and pressed 2 fingers against the German's neck. There was a pulse. Weak, trembling, human. For a second he almost pulled away, but the sound of the man's breath, shallow, wet, defiant, anchored him. The man's name, he would later learn, was Dieter Lenz, 24 years old, born in Dresden, drafted at 19. He had fought in France, then Poland, then the Eastern Front. He'd seen friends frozen to death near Smolensk, watched villagers hang from telephone poles. He had believed once that the war had meaning. But now in Berlin, all that remained was survival. The bullet that grazed his skull hadn't killed him. It had simply taken away his will to stand. When Mikhail reached him, Lenz thought the end had come. His eyes bloodshot and dim widened as the Soviet's shadow fell over him. He whispered, "Bitte, nicht," but his voice broke on the last syllable. Mikhail said nothing. He just tore a strip from his tunic and began to wrap the wound. All around them, the city screamed. Windows shattered. The ground shook as artillery thundered from the Reichstag less than a kilometer away. Every explosion carved another hole in the sky. But inside that moment, the sound seemed to fade. Mikhail's hands worked automatically, fingers stiff with grime. The bandage soaked through instantly. He pressed harder, whispering words that even he didn't understand. Something about holding on, something about silence. The German flinched, then stopped resisting. Their eyes met a long, unguarded stare between enemies who no longer knew what that word meant. Mikhail's thoughts drifted back to a frozen night near Kursk 2 years earlier. His younger brother Alexei had been hit by shrapnel. He had carried him through the snow, whispering, "Just hold on, just a little longer." But Alexei hadn't made it. Mikhail had buried him with his bare hands beneath a birch tree. That memory burned behind his eyelids every time he saw another body fall. He had promised himself that mercy was weakness, that only vengeance kept him alive. But here in the ruins of Berlin, vengeance felt hollow. He looked at the German, this thin, trembling man, who could have been anyone, and saw not an enemy but a reflection of everything he'd lost. Lenz tried to speak again. His lips moved slowly, forming words between shallow breaths. Why, he asked in broken Russian. Mikhail paused. He didn't answer. He just tightened the bandage and looked away. In his mind, the question echoed louder than the artillery. Why? Why save him? Why now, after everything? He had no answer. Only an ache that words couldn't contain. Nearby, 2 Soviet soldiers appeared from behind a collapsed wall, weapons raised. They froze when they saw Mikhail kneeling beside the German. One of them, a corporal named Vasiliev, shouted, "Leave him. Orders are clear." But Mikhail didn't move. The corporal's face twisted, half fury, half confusion. "He's the enemy," he barked. Mikhail stood slowly, his shadow towering over the wounded man. His voice was calm, flat, stripped of emotion. "He's dying," he said. "He's no enemy now." The silence that followed was heavier than the artillery. Vasiliev stared for a moment, then lowered his rifle. "Do what you want," he muttered, walking away. Lenz tried to sit up, but pain pinned him down. His right arm hung useless, his uniform torn. Mikhail reached for his canteen and poured water over the man's cracked lips. The German coughed, swallowing dirt and relief in equal measure. He whispered, "Danke," barely audible beneath the wind. Mikhail didn't reply. He just looked at him the way one looks at a mirror that shows too much truth. Hours passed like seconds. The sun bled through the haze, a dull orange disk hanging over the ruins. The smell of smoke and flesh mingled with the cold wind that blew from the spray. Somewhere in the distance, a radio crackled Soviet commanders announcing the imminent capture of the Reichstag. The city was breaking. And yet here in the rubble, two soldiers who should have been enemies shared a fragile truce born of exhaustion. Mikhail thought about how many men he had killed. Too many to count. Faces blurred together, some young, some barely older than boys. He remembered pulling a trigger and feeling nothing. He remembered the sound of bullets hitting flesh, the silence afterward. But this act of saving felt heavier than all of that combined. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. It was simply refusal. Refusal to let hatred be the only thing left when the war ended. Lenz drifted in and out of consciousness. His thoughts swirled with fragments of memory, his mother's kitchen, the smell of bread, the laughter of friends long gone. He saw flashes of light, heard the distant cries of Heil Hitler that once filled the air, now replaced by the guttural rhythm of Russian commands. He wanted to ask who this man was, why he was still alive. But his mouth couldn't form the words, so he watched instead the steady hands, the tired eyes, the quiet defiance of a man who no longer believed in orders. The photograph that would later immortalize this moment was taken by chance. A Soviet war correspondent, Nikolai Bystrov, was documenting street casualties near the Moabit sector. He had been following a medical unit snapping frames of the wounded being dragged from basements. When he turned the corner and saw Mikhail crouched beside the German, he stopped. Something about the scene froze him. Two figures, one standing, one broken, bathed in the faint glow of morning light filtering through dust. He raised his Leica and pressed the shutter. The click was swallowed by the wind. One frame. Just one. That single image would outlive them both. After the bandage was tied, Mikhail stood and looked around. The street was empty. No more gunfire, no more shouting. Just the faint crackle of flames. He could hear the distant rumble of tanks moving toward the center. He glanced back at Lenz, whose eyes were closed now, chest rising slowly. Mikhail hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small medallion, a St. George cross, tarnished and bent. It had belonged to his brother. He placed it in Lenz's hand. No words, no explanation. Then he picked up his rifle and walked away. Lenz would wake hours later surrounded by Soviet medics. They carried him to a makeshift field station, his bandage still wet. No one knew who had saved him. When asked later, he said only, "A man with eyes like ash." He never saw Mikhail again. But he kept the medallion for the rest of his life, through the camps, through the years of rebuilding, through the silence that followed peace. In his diary discovered decades later, Lenz wrote about that morning in words that still tremble on the page. "He should have shot me. I would have done it if our roles were reversed. But he didn't. He saved me." I felt his hands shaking, not from anger, but something else. Maybe he was tired. Maybe we both were. Maybe that's why we stopped fighting. Mikhail too wrote about it once in a letter to his wife that was never sent. "I don't know why I helped him," he confessed. "Maybe because my brother would have wanted me to. Maybe because I was afraid of what I'd become. I've seen so much death that I needed to remember what life felt like, even if it belonged to my enemy." The letter ended there, the ink smudged by rain. When the photograph finally surfaced years later, historians debated its meaning. Was it propaganda? Was it mercy? Was it proof that even in total war, humanity survives? But those questions missed the point. The truth is simpler. It happened, and it mattered. Because somewhere in that moment, amid the ruins of Berlin, two men born under different flags, taught to hate each other, chose for a heartbeat to be human again. And that heartbeat echoed longer than the war itself. The fall of Berlin was supposed to be the end of everything, the end of empire, the end of madness, the end of pain. But as the smoke cleared, what remained was not silence. It was confusion. The victors stood amid the ruins of what they had destroyed and realized that victory had no sound. The Soviets had outnumbered, outgunned, outlasted every defense the Reich could build. In sheer mathematics, they were unstoppable. For every German tank that rolled into battle, the Red Army had 10. For every artillery gun the Wehrmacht placed behind barricades, the Soviets had 20. Even the sky belonged to them. Between April 20th and April 30th, Soviet planes dropped over 6,000 tons of bombs on Berlin's shrinking front lines. Their dominance was absolute, industrial, tactical, and psychological. But power could not explain what came next. When the final push began, reports from Soviet command described their efficiency with surgical precision. Infantry advanced in three-line formations supported by flamethrowers and sappers who blasted through walls instead of crossing open streets. Communication units set up field radios every 5 blocks to relay orders faster than the Germans could react. The Reichstag was divided into sectors and mapped in real time as soldiers advanced through stairwells and corridors filled with smoke and gunpowder. The German defense, once terrifying in its coordination, was now a patchwork of last stands. Children in Hitler Youth uniforms manned anti-tank guns. Civilians carried ammunition through burning corridors. Every house that fell became another tomb. Yet amid this unstoppable efficiency, compassion flickered in the strangest places. Reports showed that once the fighting moved into residential zones, Soviet officers ordered strict prohibitions on the shooting of unarmed prisoners. Officially, it was to maintain discipline and avoid delays in advance. Unofficially, it was exhaustion. Soldiers had seen enough dying. They no longer wanted to kill what could not fight back. A few units even began distributing rations to captured German civilians, offering bread or water where moments earlier there had been bullets. The war was still raging, but its hatred was beginning to erode under its own weight. On May 2nd, the German command officially surrendered Berlin. The city fell. The Reichstag flag photo went around the world, a symbol of victory, of revenge fulfilled. Yet there was another photograph unseen, buried in archives, the image of a Soviet soldier bandaging a German's head in the ruins. It was quieter, humbler, and infinitely more human. It did not roar triumph. It whispered endurance. Historians would later compare the numbers and call it efficiency, one army outproducing, outflanking, outplanning the other. But beyond the statistics, something else had shifted, something harder to measure. The Soviet machine had proven it could destroy anything. Now it was proving it could choose not to. Even within the Red Army's logistical frameworks, the data told a strange story. By the last week of April, ammunition expenditure had reached an all-time high, yet casualty ratios were dropping. Prisoner counts increased dramatically. Units once ordered to eliminate resistance were now capturing thousands alive. Analysts decades later would write that the soldiers had outlasted their rage. The machine had learned restraint through exhaustion. And that restraint, small, fragile, inconsistent, became its own form of power. Soviet medics reported that nearly 1,500 German POWs were treated for wounds in those final days. Over half survived. Many were transferred to makeshift hospitals in Soviet-controlled zones where they were fed, patched, and interrogated. Some died in silence, some spoke, some cried. The archives are cold, clinical, full of signatures and stamps. But between the lines, one can read a strange tenderness, notes about finding photographs in pockets, returning rings to wounded men, scribbling words like calm or cooperative beside the names of the enemy. Those words should not exist in such documents, and yet they do. Meanwhile, across the ruins, Soviet war reporters tried to capture the moral aftermath. They wrote of soldiers standing in the center of destroyed avenues, staring at cathedrals split in half, at fountains filled with ash. Some cried, some laughed. Others simply walked away. One journalist described it as a victory that felt like mourning. The Red Army had outsmarted, outproduced, outlasted an empire, but at a cost that defied reason. The line between triumph and tragedy blurred until it became invisible. In that climate of confusion, the story of Mikhail and Lenz took on symbolic weight. It was passed from soldier to soldier, whispered in mess tents, repeated by medics who claimed to have seen it themselves. The Russian who saved a German, they said, half with pride, half with disbelief. To some it was proof that compassion could survive anything. To others it was betrayal, a weakness in the hour of revenge. But the story persisted because it captured something no victory parade could, the human cost that statistics could not erase. When interrogations began after the surrender, Soviet officers interviewed captured Wehrmacht soldiers about their experiences. Some mentioned seeing unexpected acts of mercy. One prisoner recalled how a Soviet lieutenant ordered his men to stop firing after German soldiers dropped their weapons, saying, "No one is left to hate." Another spoke of a Soviet medic who refused to abandon a wounded enemy during bombardment, saying pain doesn't wear a uniform. These testimonies were quietly archived, rarely discussed. They did not fit the narrative of ideological purity or absolute vengeance, but they existed nonetheless, threads of humanity woven through the machinery of destruction. Outflanked, outgunned, outnumbered, yes, but also in a strange, unspoken way, outgrown. The Soviet soldier, taught for years to hate without hesitation, had discovered something far more dangerous than hate empathy. That was the final victory over the enemy, over the war, over themselves. And so as the banners were raised and the tanks rolled through the ruins, as fireworks lit the night skies of Moscow and people cheered in distant cities, one image lingered in the background. A man kneeling in the dirt, pressing a bandage against the head of the man who hours earlier had tried to kill him. The world would forget the details of that encounter. The archives would mislabel it. But the photograph remains. Proof that even at the height of vengeance, the human heart could still hesitate. Years later, when historians revisited the fall of Berlin, they spoke of logistics and strategy. But those who looked deeper saw a pattern, a slow, almost invisible evolution within the chaos. Humanity reasserting itself one soldier at a time. They wrote that the Red Army not only conquered a city, but reclaimed something far older and quieter, the ability to choose compassion in the face of hatred. And in that sense, Mikhail's simple act of mercy became the mirror of an entire civilization emerging from its own darkness. Because when every statistic has been counted, every weapon silenced, every empire collapsed, what remains is the echo of that choice, the decision to save a life when you have every reason not to. That was the moment the war truly ended. Not with a surrender document, not with the raising of a flag, but with the quiet whisper of cloth against skin, and a soldier realizing that the enemy bleeding before him was no different from the brother he had lost. ChatGPT said, "When the shooting finally stopped, the sound that replaced it was almost unbearable. The creak of collapsing beams, the faint hiss of smoldering streets, the broken breathing of men who realized they were still alive." Berlin was a carcass smoking under the pale sky of early May. The Red Army had won. The Reich had fallen. But victory felt like standing in the middle of a cemetery that stretched as far as the eye could see. Mikhail Morozov walked through those ruins in silence, his rifle hanging loose, the band of sweat and soot across his forehead, stiff like dried paint. Around him, soldiers shouted for prisoners to line up, for civilians to step forward, for surrender papers to be signed. It was the sound of authority trying to make sense of chaos. But Mikhail heard something else, the memory of a voice whispering "thank you" in broken Russian. He had not spoken of what happened. Not to his comrades. Not to his officers. The war was over, and yet the weight of that moment clung to him like the ash in his lungs. He wondered if the German had survived. He wondered if he remembered his face. But there was no way to know. Everything human seemed to dissolve after victory, and names, faces, small mercies, all swallowed by reports and orders. Officially, Mikhail was listed as present uninjured performance exemplary. No mention of the man he saved. No record of the bandage. But memory is its own record, and his mind replayed that scene every time he closed his eyes. Commanders gathered at dawn to inspect the aftermath. The city's defenders had been annihilated, their generals captured or dead. Hitler's suicide was whispered among the ranks, half believed, half ignored. Tanks rolled past piles of brick and twisted iron. Red banners hung from what remained of buildings. The world declared peace. But the men who fought it knew better. Peace was not an ending, it was an aftershock. It came with ghosts, with guilt, with the hollow realization that hatred had nowhere left to go. In the following days, the Soviet press filled its pages with numbers. 600,000 German prisoners captured. 20,000 tons of enemy weapons seized. 5,000 armored vehicles destroyed. But the men who wrote those reports did not walk through the alleys filled with the smell of burnt bread and rain-soaked corpses. They did not hear the soft cries of children calling for mothers who would never answer. Those who did hear it, men like Mikhail, stopped speaking altogether. Somewhere in a makeshift field hospital north of the Tiergarten, Dieter Lenz opened his eyes to a dim light. His head throbbed beneath the bandages. The world smelled of iodine smoke and stale water. Around him, rows of wounded men lay motionless, their groans forming a low hum that blended with the distant rumble of tanks being towed away. A nurse adjusted his dressing, said nothing, and moved on. He didn't ask where he was. He didn't need to. The war was over for him, but not because of surrender, because someone somewhere had chosen not to finish him. For days, Lenz drifted between dreams and fever. He saw flashes of rubble faces blurred by light. He remembered the Soviet soldiers' eyes, gray, hollow, almost calm. He remembered the pressure of hands on his skin, the steady rhythm of breathing that wasn't his own. He had been taught that Russians were beasts that they killed without hesitation. But the man who saved him had not looked like a beast. He had looked like someone who had already lost too much to hate. Lenz felt shame rise inside him, not for losing, but for ever believing the lies that brought him here. On the other side of the city, the Soviet High Command held its debriefings. Generals celebrated strategy. Officers discussed logistics. The words liberation and revenge floated through the smoke-filled rooms like two sides of the same coin. But among the lower ranks, the mood was quieter. Soldiers sat in circles sharing cigarettes, staring at the fires burning on the horizon. No songs, no toasts, just silence. When someone finally spoke, it was always the same question: what now? What do we do with all this victory? No one had an answer. Mikhail was reassigned to post-war cleanup, ordered to escort civilians and record damages. Each street he entered felt like déjà vu, broken walls, melted glass faces half covered in dust. He passed groups of German prisoners clearing rubble, their heads bowed. Some flinched when they saw the red star on his sleeve. He wanted to tell them he didn't care anymore, that it was over. But words had lost their use. One day, while distributing rations to captured soldiers, he caught sight of a man with a bandaged head sitting in the corner of a makeshift camp. For a moment, his heart stopped. It couldn't be. The angle of the face, the slope of the shoulders, it all felt familiar. But when he stepped closer, he saw the difference in the eyes. Not him. Just another survivor wearing the same mask of exhaustion. Weeks turned into months. Summer came washing the ruins with rain. Grass began to grow through cracks in the pavement. Berlin smelled of wet stone and new beginnings. Mikhail wrote one final letter before returning home. "I have seen the face of my enemy," he wrote, "and it looked like my own. Perhaps that is why I could not shoot." The letter was never mailed. It remained folded in his pocket until he boarded the train east. Years later, Lenz would sit in a rebuilt Dresden cafe, his hands shaking, as he traced the outline of a small medallion, tarnished, bent, the St. George Cross. He had kept it through the camps, through interrogation, through hunger. It reminded him that once, amid ruin, a stranger had chosen to see him as human. He never knew the man's name. When his granddaughter later asked him about the war, he didn't speak of battles or victories. He spoke of that single moment. "I was supposed to die," he said, "but I didn't. Because mercy survived where reason failed." Back in Russia, Mikhail lived quietly. He worked in a factory, raised 2 children, rarely mentioned Berlin. But every May, when Victory Day parades thundered through the streets, he stood at his window and watched. He didn't cheer. He didn't salute. He simply whispered under his breath, "He's alive." History moved on cold and impartial. Nations rebuilt. Enemies became allies. The photograph, the one taken by Bistrov, resurfaced decades later in an archive labeled Humanitarian Efforts. No one knew the names of the men in it. Scholars debated whether it was staged propaganda or genuine, but the truth didn't need defending. The truth was in the stillness of their faces, in the way the hands met without weapons between them. It was in the silence that followed the silence of men who had finally outlived the noise. In 1965, during a commemorative exhibition in Moscow, the image was displayed for the first time. Viewers stood before it and said nothing. Some wept. Some looked away. A single caption sat beneath the frame: "Unknown Soviet soldier aiding wounded German POW, Berlin, 1945. That was all. No triumph, no ideology, no names. Just a fragment of humanity carved out of catastrophe. Mikhail never saw the exhibition. He died a year earlier, buried in a small town outside Smolensk. His family never knew that a piece of his story hung in a museum. But perhaps he would have preferred it that way. For him, it wasn't about glory. It was about the choice that defined him, a decision made in seconds that outlasted a lifetime. And so, as the decades passed, and the world forgot the noise of Berlin's last days, the photograph remained. It traveled from archive to archive, its edges yellowed, its image faint but intact. Two men, one standing, one wounded, one choosing to save, one unable to understand why. That image outlived the cities they fought for, the governments they served, and the flags that divided them. Because mercy once given doesn't fade. It waits. It echoes. It survives the ruins and becomes the only kind of victory that time can't erase. Decades later, when the ruins had long turned into avenues and the fires had become monuments, the story of that morning still whispered through the dust of history. Berlin rebuilt itself from ash, new buildings, new flags, new names, but the ghosts never left. They lingered in photographs, in archives, in the quiet tremor of old men's hands. Time moved forward, relentless, polishing away the edges of memory until only fragments remained. Yet the image of two soldiers, one Soviet, one German, remained untouched, immune to revision, immune to politics. It was not about who won or who lost. It was about what survived when everything else was gone. In the late 1980s, an archivist named Irina Petrova stumbled upon the photograph while cataloging declassified war images. The file was mislabeled, buried under administrative paperwork. The caption read, "Only medical assistance to POW, Sector C, Berlin." She studied the picture for hours, tracing the outline of the Soviet soldier's face, the curve of his hand, the faint expression of disbelief on the German's. Something about it felt alive, like a heartbeat caught between frames. She decided to publish it in a small exhibition called Echoes of Humanity. When the exhibit opened, people walked past the grand portraits of generals and tanks, stopping only at that single frame. It silenced the room. Veterans who had seen 100 battles stood motionless before it, their eyes damp, their throats tight. One man whispered, "I knew someone like him." Another murmured, "That's what I wanted to remember." No one could identify the two men. But maybe that was the point. Their anonymity made them universal symbols of every act of mercy that went unseen, every moment when war paused to remember. It was made of people. Newspapers in Moscow, Dresden, Warsaw, even London reprinted the image. Some called it propaganda. Others called it proof that even monsters have hearts. But those who looked closely saw something deeper. They saw fatigue. They saw surrender, not the kind written on paper, but the surrender of hate. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the war's end, a journalist tracked down an elderly man living in Dresden, a retired engineer named Dieter Lenz. He walked with a cane, his face lined, but his eyes sharp. When shown the photograph, he said nothing for a long time. His fingers trembled as he touched the image. "Yes," he said finally, his voice cracked but certain. That was him. The reporter asked if he remembered the soldier's name. Lenz shook his head. "No name," he said softly. "Only his eyes." He looked at me as if I were already forgiven. The journalist pressed further. Why did he think the man saved him? Lenz smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes from carrying a secret for too long. "Because we were both tired," he said. because mercy was all we had left. When the article was published, it reached a small village near Smolensk, where an old widow named Ekaterina Morozova read it aloud to her grandchildren. Her hands trembled when she reached the name of the German soldier. She turned to the old photograph hanging on her wall, the one of her husband in uniform, taken just before he left for the front. She whispered his name as if calling him back from Tump. She didn't need confirmation. She knew. The story fit too perfectly, the date, the place, the way he had written in his letters about losing his brother and finding something he couldn't explain. She smiled through her tears and said, "He kept his promise." The exhibition grew. The photograph toured across Europe and beyond Paris, Tokyo, New York. Crowds stared at it and saw different things. Some saw redemption, some saw contradiction, some saw themselves. In classrooms, teachers used it to explain empathy to students who had never known war. In documentaries, it appeared between explosions and statistics, a single, still frame of stillness amid chaos. But the truth was simpler. It wasn't a story about nations. It was a story about two men who forgot to hate long enough to remember they were alive. Time eroded everything else, the medals, the speeches, the monuments, but not that image. Its power came from what it refused to explain. There were no flags, no slogans, no glory. Just hands, dust, and breath. It defied history's appetite for certainty. It reminded those who saw it that the real miracle of survival wasn't endurance, it was compassion. In the quiet halls of the Central War Museum in Moscow, the photograph still hangs today. Tourists stop before it whispering. Some touch the glass as if reaching through time. The plaque beneath has been replaced with a single sentence. In every war, there are moments when humanity wins. No names, no ranks, just that. Outside, the city moves on cars, laughter, neon lights, the hum of a world too busy to remember. But sometimes, in the stillness of a passing evening, when the sun sinks and the street lamps hum, it feels as if the air itself carries the echo of that moment. The sound of cloth tearing into a bandage, the breath of a man deciding not to kill, the whisper of gratitude that outlived the gunfire. And in that echo lies a question that has never truly faded. What if every soldier had made the same choice? What if vengeance had given way to understanding before the last bullet fell? What if the measure of victory was not how many lives were taken, but how many were spared? No historian can answer that. No monument can hold it. But somewhere beyond the reach of orders and borders, that question continues to breathe. It drifts through generations like a quiet warning that cruelty is easy, mercy is costly, and the true battlefield of humanity lies within the human heart. The story ends where it began, with a man standing over another, their eyes locked not in hatred, but in recognition. One reached out his hand, the other accepted. Between them was everything history tried to destroy and everything it could not. And so, in the endless aftermath of every war, their image remains a frozen heartbeat in the chaos of history. A reminder that even in our darkest hour, the smallest act of compassion can outshine an empire's fall. The guns stopped, the cities rebuilt, the nations forgot, but the mercy of one man refused to die. Because when time has buried the noise and the flags, when the last survivor has gone silent and the books have turned to dust, only one truth will remain. That somewhere in Berlin, in the spring of 1945, a soldier chose not to hate, and in doing so saved far more than a life. He saved what was left of the human soul.